Hello, welcome back to Money Network. We're talking today about graphite. Although gold's been taking up a lot of the headlines recently, we thought we'd actually take a bit of a pause on that and look at a different market. Graphite has actually had some really interesting news as well, one of which being that the world's largest producer of graphite, Syrah Resources, have halted production in Mozambique. There was no production last quarter. It doesn't look like there's going to be any in this quarter. On top of that, we've also started to see some export bans come through from China. So really the question is there going to be a deficit in this market this year? And how excited can we be by the graphite market given the headlines? Joining me to discuss is James Willoughby, the senior analyst at leading research group Wood Mackenzie. James, given the headlines, are you excited by the year ahead?
um, Look, I think we're always generally quite conservative in our views, and I think this year is no different. Um, you mentioned the export bans, you mentioned the largest producer going offline. I think both of those are going to have less impact on the market than people are maybe uh, talking about. Um, I mean, if we start with the export bans, um, you know, the latest round was China putting restrictions on the export of graphite based materials on specific US defense companies. It was a very targeted approach and you know very specific to that defense sector. And if you go back to the original bans that were in December 22, again, a lot of the products that were sort of highlighted there were for the defense sector. Um, a couple were around the battery space, but realistically, what we've seen is very little impact on the battery market. It has been mostly around defense, and realistically, the US doesn't get much of its graphite for those defense applications from China anyway, just because of national security concerns. So the impact hasn't been significant in terms of long-term volumes. Obviously there was some disruption around the introduction of the new export licenses and the renewals, as you would expect from that kind of thing. But the long-term impact has been minimal to date. Um, Now, with the supply coming out of Mozambique, um, you're right, Syrah, the largest producer outside of China, they didn't produce anything last quarter, and they were sort of forced to go offline because of civil unrest in the country. And we've seen a lot of disruption across some of the other metals as well. Um, the situation there does seem to be slowly improving. You know, Obviously there hasn't been a complete breakthrough yet, but the signs are that there is going to be some sort of agreement on sort of the political stage at some point relatively soon. And then we would expect Syrah to come back into the market, and I believe they're targeting end of Q1, Q2 to come back into the space. Um, so yeah, I think you know the the big headlines out there are maybe a bit overblown at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's quite easy to get fooled just by reading the headlines. But on Syra, from what I remember, their operating costs are around $500 per ton, roughly. Obviously, changed depending on the output, but that's roughly around from memory what they were selling their graphite concentrate at into China. So even if they did come back online, is there not an issue there where they would really need to ramp up scale to a point where we're at risk of them flooding the market like they have in years gone by?
Yeah, so costs are around that sort of, I mean, obviously, as you said, variable, but sort of 450 to sort of $600 a ton. But they're selling for, you know, maybe slightly above that at the moment. And I think that comes from their sort of shift in strategy over the last year or so. So, previously they were selling a lot of that fines material into China to feed the volumes for the anode market over there. But because of the local competition and the shift to synthetic anode in China, they've sort of pivoted and they're selling more into sort of Western markets, into India, countries like that, where they can get a slightly higher premium. So there is a market out there for them, and definitely we do see them coming back and producing. But I think like last year, and even the year before, volumes are going to be much lower than their capacity. They've got over 300,000 tons of capacity. Really they've never hit those sort of volumes because the demand hasn't been there for a couple of years.
Obviously, they had around 150 million investment from the DFC, I think, back in November. They are cashed up. They've obviously got this downstream processing that they're looking at in the US. From their point of view, is because from me, by the way that I'm looking at it, is it doesn't look like a profitable operation just creating a concentrate on its own at current levels. And if they were to then ramp up to that 300,000 mark, I mean, like we saw a few years ago, would just completely crash that market, right? So, which wouldn't do them any favors or anyone else. So, I guess from the way that you're looking at it, is this now just a change of strategy for them to then turn into a downstream player, create spherical graphite, and actually have a bit more of a premium on their sales through the US?
Yeah, I think that's the way the market's been heading over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. Is that typically, new mines need to be linked to a downstream project to get that investment and to have that margin and get the interest of investors. So definitely they're looking at shifting more downstream and producing more volume from their Vidalia plant in Louisiana in the US. But I think so far it's been a bit of a struggle to get up to the volumes that they've been looking, just because demand hasn't been quite what they were hoping, I think.
Okay, what's the current size of the graphite market annually, and what are Woodmac looking at in terms of forecasting out through to the end of the decade? How are you thinking this might change?
Yeah, so for the natural side, and this includes flake, amorphous, and vein graphite. This year, last year I should say now, it was just around 1.7 million tons, and then you've got synthetic graphite, which was 3.8. And by the end of the decade, we actually see natural graphite demand growing pretty slowly, so only reaching 1.9 million tons, and then synthetic at 5.6. And really, that's because of the anode market. China is so heavily invested and linked into the synthetic graphite chain. It is the biggest, EV producer. It's the biggest battery producer. So most of the market is dominated by the growth in that sector, and so synthetic graphite. Whereas natural, has a part to play in that battery market, but more dominated by Western consumers, where the EV market is perhaps growing a bit more slowly than people would have liked.
Interesting. Okay, so you're only really forecasting an increase of around 200,000 tons between now and 2030.
Yeah, it's not massive.
Okay, that's surprising because a lot of other sort of things I've heard in the market are up to 1 million or higher. So that does seem conservative. In terms of the synthetic side, one of the things that I was always told on the synthetic side is the process to create synthetic graphite is very, very energy consuming. So and it's actually quite costly. Can China compete on the cost side versus natural flake graphite with synthetic? Have those costs come down?
So absolutely, it's a very energy intensive process. You've got to heat the graphite to several thousand degrees for several weeks or months, and then that's a huge amount of energy. The advantage that China has on the cost side with energy is it's got a huge amount of very cheap coal powered electricity in places like in Mongolia, and so obviously that helps. And things like the integration through the supply chain, the sheer scale that some of these operations are at, all of that helps to lower costs. Our view is still that natural graphite is cheaper to produce, but the cell manufacturers in China are so embedded with synthetic now. There's a lot of advancements on the technology side as well to hopefully lower the costs there. It's hard to see how in China specifically, natural can really shift that and gain market share. Um, Obviously outside of China, it's a pretty different story. You know, the cell manufacturers in the rest of the world are using a much more even split of natural and synthetic graphite. There is obviously a huge need for new anode projects, new mines to supply those outside of China. Particularly with the US Inflation Reduction Act, the Foreign Entity of Concern clauses coming in 2027. There will be a need for new graphite, and that is where we see the growth and the opportunity for the market.
Obviously, we were talking about the need for downstream processing earlier, and you alluded to that most of these new mines that want to go into production really need to be linked to one of those. But if you are looking at the concentrate side, like we were saying, the fines are sort of selling for about 500 US per ton. Most operating mines creating concentrate are operating around that cost, either higher, a little bit lower, but there's no real margins there. So it sort of limits the amount of new production that can come online. That even though you're forecasting quite a small increase in the graphite market, 200,000 tons by the end of the decade, is there enough supply that can come online given how hard it is to finance a graphite mine at the moment, and obviously these constraints with the downstream?
Yeah, so I think just touching on the prices there, what we're seeing is the market bifurcating between China and the rest of the world because of that need for, IRA compliant supply and, essentially an ex-China supply chain. We are seeing higher prices outside of China, and so there is a bit more of an opportunity for margin there and investment. In terms of the supply that can come online, when we're looking at the anode material specifically, and looking at what could go into the US and be compliant with all of those regulations, we're still seeing a shortfall out to 2030 and beyond. Just because they're not ramping up quite as quickly as people were hoping, and obviously these low prices aren't helping that. And then as you come further down the supply chain to the mines, obviously there's still that need to supply into those anode projects as well. So definitely we think there's still space for new supply in the market.
How much do you add weight? Obviously, you mentioned IRA there and supply from ex-China. We're seeing some tariffs and some trade wars starting to bubble up again now. The response from China was a bit light from the first round of tariffs. Obviously, it was only a 10% increase originally, but I'm not getting the sense that Donald Trump really cares about IRA or sort of the ESG compliance that perhaps the Biden administration did. Do you think that's still a big factor in terms of this bifurcation of markets?
Yeah, look, I think Trump has said before that he's not a fan of the IRA personally, but given how much investment has gone into Republican states under that law, it's hard to see why his party would want to suddenly remove that. It's very beneficial for them and their constituents. So we think it will remain in place. And, some of Trump's first executive orders, he was very strong on the fact that he wanted a US supply chain for critical minerals. He called out rare earths specifically. But there is still that desire to, have a more diversified supply chain, across the entire critical minerals space. So, we think that the IRA will remain in place. It might be limited in part, particularly around, tax credits that are available to automotive producers and cell producers. But definitely the critical minerals side, we think that's still going to be strongly embedded.
So investors looking at, or anyone really looking at the graphite market, and there are a number of mining companies listed and private who are at a development stage or very close to a development stage with feasibility studies. Are you anticipating that Because, like you said, at the moment, the current prices aren't really helping anyone. Are you expecting a price increase to, I guess, incentivize some of these new mines to come online?
Yeah, so with the main prices that you see in the market, it's all benchmarked to China. It's pinned really to that market. Um, and so when you're looking at those prices, we actually think they're going to stay pretty low because China itself is very oversupplied. What we're seeing now is the emergence of new benchmarks for Europe and particularly in the US. Um, and we think those are going to be much stronger performing um, this year and next.
Okay, so you guys do believe, because it's something that we've heard about, especially in things like the nickel market, for example, about clean versus dirty nickel, or we're going to see a differentiation in pricing based on where it's sourced from and how ethically it is versus Indonesia and other places, for example. So essentially, what you're saying is that are we already starting to see that in the graphite market? Are we already starting to see a premium in places like Europe or North America for anode material?
So I think the difference between graphite and some of those other markets is that this is a real restriction on supply. When you look at the US IRA and the Foreign Entity of Concern, you can't use graphite sourced from China in your batteries, and so that creates a much smaller pool of supply. And, law of supply and demand must mean higher prices. Um, we have seen, historically, slightly higher prices for Europe than China, just because of limited supply there and shipping costs, etc. And we are expecting those to increase slightly, but the legislation in the EU isn't quite as strong as that in the US, and so that still will be able to source from China, and there's not going to be too much for a premium there. The US is, as I said, kind of a isolated market from China, and that's going to create those supply demand dynamics that we think will push prices higher.
How far away? Obviously, we've seen the DFC invest in companies like Syrah and build downstream processing in Louisiana. There's been other companies like Blenco who have had grants from the DFC to help progress feasibility studies and get to that investment decision. Um, it, it, what is the actual size of the US market at the moment for graphite, and how much of that 200,000 tons that you're expecting to increase actually is coming from North America? I'm just trying to get an understanding of how big this ex-China market could be and what the opportunity is for those who aren't within it.
Yeah, I mean, the US itself isn't particularly large at the moment because you don't have processing located there, and because the EV market is starting to ramp up, and you know these sorts of problems are constraining it. So it's not massive. As we start to see those anode plants go in, we are expecting quite a bit of growth in the US. So if we take sort of just natural graphite for last year in North America as a whole, it was only around sort of 80,000 tons. We're expecting that to grow to sort of over 100,000 tons by the end of the decade, as that starts to ramp up. So it is small on that side, but that's where a lot of the pricing opportunity is, I guess. And obviously, sorry, just to clarify, our demand forecasts are based on sort of flake to anode, and so it relies on the fact that those anode plants are being built. Obviously, if you build more of those and they start to sort of come online and expand, that will increase the demand for flake. But those anodes are where we see the bottleneck for US demand at the moment.
The only concern then, if demand growth isn't as high as what I've heard from others in the market, from what you're saying, is what is the risk that someone like Syrah could come back online and reach their maximum output and essentially flood the market? Is that something that you're foreseeing, that, well, not even flood the market, but make up the rest of the gap so that other developers potentially aren't required?
So I think the state of the graphite market has probably changed from previous years. So, as we've sort of been discussing in this whole conversation, the focus is really around the anode side, and the individual cell manufacturers partner with an individual anode producer who then typically has their own mine. And obviously, Syrah has Vidalia in the US and the Balam mine in Mozambique, and that is one part of that supply chain. But you'll have competitors who are supplying to other cell makers who have their other anode plant and their own mine, and that whole supply chain will be needed because the specifications are so tight for anode and cell producers. They need to know exactly where their graphite is coming from, exactly how much is produced with what impurities. And so it's not as simple as, I'll start up an anode plant and I'll just buy flake from anyone in the market, because, you don't know the exact sort of signature of the graphite that's going into your final cell.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's all about product specification, isn't it, at the end of the day? It's very similar to lithium, direct lithium extraction. You can't put one brine in DLR as you can another. It's really built for that configuration. Good. Okay. Well, I guess what are you most looking out for at the moment, looking forward into the next 2025? Are there any big milestones that you're looking out for that potentially could disrupt the market or change your thesis?
Yeah, so I think silicon anode materials are always the one that people point to as a potential disruptor. We are starting to see the silicon carbon composites now coming, into their own, starting to pick up volume, starting to move into the EV markets, where obviously that's the biggest opportunity for anode materials. We've always been, as we always are, quite conservative with how quickly those will come into the market. Obviously, if there is a sudden adoption of those, particularly inside China, we would expect the demand outlook to change quite considerably. But even with silicon carbon, you need graphite in that mix to constrain the expansion of silicon. So, it's not going to completely kill off the graphite market in any sense. So, even with our long-term outlook, and you start to see new technologies like silicon dominant materials and hard carbons for sodium ion, things like this, graphite is still the dominant anode material by volume, even out to 2050.
Okay, all right. And it's something that used to be touted a lot, especially over the last few years with the lithium side and the NMC battery chemistry, is usually when a plant has been built, it's very hard for them to change the chemistry of the battery that they're making, right? Because it's built with those specifications. So all of these gigafactories that we are seeing, they all require graphite, or the vast majority require graphite at the moment, right? So I'm assuming the demand side from that, there's less downside risk. It's really working out what the upside risk is, or the upside potential is, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think with most automotive companies, most cell manufacturers, they have a sort of 3, 4, 5 year, forward view. And so anything, they're going to produce in 5 years, they need to have the technology for now, basically. So you've got at least, 5+ years where it's going to be completely graphite dominated. And then I think we'll start to see silicon come in slightly more significant volumes.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So perhaps the headlines don't suggest a huge bull market in graphite, as you could probably be forgiven for thinking that way by reading it, but still an opportunity by the sounds of it for some of these new developers with high quality flake graphite with potential for downstream processing outside of the China market to still actually become profitable mines and make shareholders happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. All right, James, really appreciate the update. Thank you.
Thanks for your time, Peter.